All right. Welcome, everyone. Anyone who cares to watch this. You may notice that this is a bit different from anything else that I've put out on my channel thus far, and that is because I am currently working on another video that is taking a lot longer to script and tape and edit and record than I'd really hoped for. And in the meantime, I thought it might be interesting to put out something a little bit more freeform, try something different for me. So this is not scripted. I am just an idiot with a microphone, and I'm going to talk at you about my WoW hot takes in honor of the upcoming reveal of the Midnight expansion, because I am that kind of nerd, and I have a crippling WoW addiction. So at least something is going to come of that. Alright, so starting from the top. Hot take number one. The story of WoW has never been well told. And no, I don't mean that the modern expansions are bad and the story has taken bad turns, although that is absolutely true. I am also referring to the original expansions, that it being Vanilla, BC, Wrath of the Lich King. The story has always been very poorly told in the macro sense. But it has been different for very different reasons, I will say. So I think the problems with modern WoW at this point have been very well articulated by a lot of people, but I think the biggest problem is an unwillingness on the part of Blizzard to change the status quo of their property. So at some point in the past, I don't know, say 10 years or so, Blizzard decided in their great wisdom that they would never kill off any legacy characters ever again. And I think that this singular decision has resulted in a lot of weirdness that some people have interpreted in a lot of different ways, but I think the biggest example that I can point to is possibly in the Battle for Dazar Lore raid expansion, or just raid. It was a patch, not the point. This is why I script shit normally. So in the Battle for Dazar Lore, we fight 3 faction leaders, and only one of them ends up actually dying as a result of this. And that leader is King Rastakhan. He is notably also the only Horde faction leader that we fight during this raid. So I've seen a lot of people since then pointing to this as an example of alliance bias. I mean, literally, we fight Mekatork, and Mekatork has since then gone on to do exactly nothing. But the thing that I think is more notable about that in particular is the fact that King Rastakhan is the only faction leader who is not a legacy character. So he was not introduced in Warcraft 3, he was not introduced in Vanilla or BC or Wrath. And that is what I would now consider a legacy character. It is now to the point that it has resulted in a lot of weirdness in the storytelling. That was a relatively small quirk, but after that, you have the much larger arc of Blizzard fumbling the ball very hard, obviously seemingly leading to killing off Sylvanas, and then just pulling off at the very last moment. And instead pulling this really bizarre redemption arc-ish treatment. I don't know. I assume she's coming back at some point. I mean, they left the story fully open, and if they weren't going to kill her off, then implicitly that tells me that she'll be back. And with us going back to Quel'Thalas in midnight, I presume that's going to be a lot sooner rather than later. But it's down to so many smaller details as well. Like, honestly, at the beginning of the current expansion, War Within, I was a bit pleasantly surprised that they seemingly had killed off Khadgar. Boy, I should have been a lot more underwhelmed by that in retrospect. But yeah, there's an exceeding reluctance to change the status quo in the newer storytelling, which, interestingly, I think is the exact opposite problem of the problems with classic lore, because, as I said, it is also far from perfect. See, I think the problem with classic lore stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of generally the characters and how their interactions work. So, what do I mean by this? I mean, like, if you take a look at, say, Illidan, coming from Warcraft 3, that we would kill him, that the Horde and the Alliance would kill him as this massive end boss, makes so shockingly little sense that they have since spent like decades trying to go back on that decision and fill in the blanks as to why we were there. I mean, at the time, I don't know that we even knew why the Dark Portal was opened. We just randomly stumbled our way into Outlands and murdered all of the, I'm going to say it, the best characters from Warcraft 3. So what it comes down to is that classic lore was just very random in a way that shows me that the writers just did not know what to do with these characters. I do not know who was behind the broader strokes of the story. Possibly it was Chris Metzen. If it was Chris Metzen, who was previously on Warcraft 3, I have no idea what happened to cook his brain so utterly. But that's what it comes down to, I feel. And on top of that, there is just a massive sense of disconnectedness to classic lore that's almost difficult to spot until someone points it out to you, at which point you start noticing it everywhere, in that a lot of times the characters involved with individual conflicts are the absolute wrong ones. Like, if we're going to take a couple years forward, and we're going to take a look at Wrath of the Lich King, you might ask yourself the question, why... Okay, it may not have occurred to you previously, but why are we following Tyrion Fordring at the moment that the Lich King is killed? From first glance, especially coming from Warcraft 3, again, which is, at least in my opinion, probably the best storytelling that WoW has had to offer, that the Warcraft universe, rather, has had to offer. Coming off of that, there are a few characters that you would think would feature a lot more prominently in the fall of the Lich King, namely Sylvanas and Jaina, at the very least, just off the top of my head. So they do absolutely appear in Icecrown for that set of mini dungeons, the Soul Engine, the Pit of Saffron, and the Halls of Reflection. We're going to circle back to that, but why weren't they there for the actual battle with the Lich King? these are the characters who clearly had the most stakes in that conflict. They had the most interesting relationships with him, both before and after his fall. Jaina was implied to have been his lover, and then later confirmed in later lore books to have had an explicit affair with Arthas. Afterwards, she was essentially left on her own to completely pick up the pieces of the kingdom and the people that Arthas left behind, taking them west towards Kalimdor. So her entire arc has come about as a result of his actions, of the fact that he destroyed Lordaeron, that he tore it down as in service to the Lich King. And that has caused her a lot of hardship, and that is something that goes almost entirely unexplored unless you finish the Shadowmourne quest line, in which case she has exactly 2 or 3 lines expressing any sort of remorse on it. The same, I would say, goes for Sylvanas. Though Sylvanas gets a lot more of an arc with Arthas in the Frozen Throne itself, these 2 characters are actually very similar. They both suffered at Arthas' hands, and they were both placed on a path toward ultimately leadership as a result of these horrible atrocities that he committed. They had a different starting point for that relationship, which I think would be interesting to explore. So why weren't they actually there when we were fighting the Lich King? I mean, don't get me wrong, Tyrion's clearly got a manly bro vibe going on, and he's a bit concerned about how this Arthas character is ruining the vibe. But frankly, why is he so mad about this? There are a lot of people, I feel, who could have been a lot closer in line in order to get that punch in. And on top of this, toward that point about disconnection, something that I'd never really thought to question before is why were there separate versions of those dungeons that we mentioned earlier? You start with the Forge of Souls. If you're Horde, you start with Sylvanas, and if you're Alliance, you start with Jaina. And you follow through, and they have, as I said, they have a very similar arc. So they both have a very similar arc in these dungeons themselves. How much more interesting would it have been if both of them had been in there for both the Horde and the Alliance? So we're bringing these characters together who have very similar arcs, but who implicitly hate each other for being on opposite sides of the faction conflict, or I don't know, maybe they've never interacted before. I honestly can't think of any point where they would have interacted before, so I think this would be a very interesting and humanizing moment for both of them to realize that they're not alone in that conflict. But this goes completely under the radar in favor of disconnecting things and in favor of propping up this guy who just thinks that Arthas is violating the bro code. And on top of that, again, talking about the transition between Classic and Warcraft 3, there's a lot of weirdness that goes on there that I still don't think has ever been fully and adequately explained. I mean, they brush off the idea that the factions should have been united as in the first line of the vanilla cinematic. But at the end, yeah, sure, old hatreds and all that. But Jaina was very explicitly still advocating for peace between the Horde and the Alliance, and frankly, why does she have a stronger relationship with Varian and the Alliance of Stormwind, which was essentially just reinvented whole cloth in order for World of Warcraft to exist as it did. Why is her relationship with Stormwind so much stronger than with the Orcs of Orgrimmar, that she re-allies herself, that she's literally hostile to Horde players, to Orgrimmar? And the cherry on top, why were the Night Elves on the Alliance side? That makes literally no sense. I mean, I don't think Jaina ever talked to the Night Elves at all. Mostly because you weren't playing as them at that point. Like, I mean, honestly, the pact between the Night Elves, the Alliance, and the Horde was very abrupt in Warcraft 3, and so there wasn't really very much time to develop those relationships. Because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, I'm just saying that it seems a bit random, which I think is a running theme throughout particularly Classic and into BC. There's a lot of elements that come into play that are just very random. And I think this is also something that has started to creep back in the modern expansions, in that we get a lot of very random plot elements, just as I think that is more as a result of Blizzard trying to differentiate the patches of the same expansion to a point that makes them very incoherent, just narratively. So, like, for example, the War Within, we start with delving within, the whole War Within thing. We fight the Nerubian Empire. All of the posters have us fighting the Nerubian Empire, but we go down there and we fix it over the course of one patch. And then suddenly we're in Undermine, and then suddenly the War Within becomes the War Without, and we're now in Koresh, battling with the Ethereals and with Dimensius. And to be clear, having just recently killed Dimensius with my guild on normal, it is an absolutely magnificent fight, but it feels like we've lost the plot a little bit from the whole War Within thing. Like, I could be wrong about this, but what is the entire deal with this whole with Beledar? We had an entire build-up for that. We had a massive section of the story that was set in there, and although the finale for the original campaign was set in there, as far as I'm aware, we haven't really solved what Beledar actually is. How did the Arathi get down here? And it's that sort of randomness which, although it does allow us to move throughout a lot of different and varied environments, also just makes it feel like a lot of these things are losing the plot. Like, we start off a lot of expansions with one through line, and then halfway through we fully abandon that to go and do something completely different. Like, we have completely forgotten the Radiant Song in The War Within. That appeared, that was the initial catalyst for everything, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think we actually ended up going back on that. Alright. Okay, and this is going to be a bit of a spicier take, I feel, but tied into that first point, I think, in fact, the best storytelling in all of WoW was Late Mists into early Warlords of Draenor. Alright, now, please, put down the pitchforks. I understand why you're mad. Just hear me out. Okay, so Mists of Pandaria, at least in the beginning, was a very it had a very strong through line. It had a very strong war campaign that just began the expansion and carried through as a single narrative through line for the entire expansion. We begin with, both factions begin with an escalating conflict in the Jade Forest, each invading different sides of the continent, clashing with the Horde, the Alliance, making allies of the native, mostly peaceful native inhabitants, and we end with the end of that conflict. And I think that is a very strong through line. Really, silliness aside, just general Pandaria silliness, aside, I think it is it has a very strong through line. There are a few moments where it stumbles with some of the characters, like Tyrande. Oh gosh, a moment of patience if you've played it. Tyrande, the 10,000-year-old night elf, needs to be given a talking to by Varian, the most dude, truly the most dude of all time. So there's clearly still some problems there, but there's an interesting through line in the way that Varian and Garrosh are contrasted as characters. They start off as very similar characters, driven by their bloodlust, their want for domination, and you see throughout the expansion how Varian softens and Garrosh hardens. As Varian accepts more allies into the fold and learns patience and tolerance from his son, who honestly they really should have kept Anduin as the small and sensitive priest that he was always meant to be. His whole paladin arc, I'm sure I'll get to this at some point in the future, possibly in this video, but there is an unwillingness to treat Anduin with anything other than kid gloves, despite the fact that he is now a grizzled war veteran who is commanding the power of possibly the most powerful faction on Azeroth, and there is a complete unwillingness to question that. And we will, like I said, we will get back to that. But for now, we're going to refocus on Garrosh. He is possibly the best villain who originated in World of Warcraft and whose arc was completely within World of Warcraft. As far as I'm aware, he was not at all in the lore before his introduction in Burning Crusade, and his journey, I think, was relatively well told. I think it loses itself through Cataclysm, because I think the writers were still deciding what they wanted to be done with him, because on the one hand, you get moments where he tosses War Crimes General off of the side of a cliff in Stone Talon Mountains, and on the other hand, the expansion ends, or Mists begins rather, with him also committing war crimes. So we have to take that with a grain of salt, but I think we arrive at an interesting place where we are giving a real critique to what the Horde is. Yes, this was a critique already leveled in Warcraft 3, but I think it's the sort of thing that would recur. I don't think that's something that would disappear overnight, and so I'm going to allow that for now. Again, we will get back to that. And so, going from there to Warlords of Draenor, there's a bit of a gap there. So, there is a novel, War Crimes, which is is set between those two expansions and is meant to fill in those gaps. Honestly, I think there is a lot of problems with keeping some very significant lore out of the actual game and putting it in a novel that probably 80% of the player base is not going to read. But regardless, I think the biggest hot take that I can offer right here is that I think Warlords of Draenor possibly had the best, like, up till today, from Classic to War Within, where we currently are, had the best leveling campaign of anything, by a very wide margin. It had a lot of stakes, it had a lot of grandiosity, and it is possibly one of the few times that, especially in modern expansions, that I have not felt like we were just engaging in busy work. There is a problem, I feel, with a lot of the modern quest lines, in that a lot of them feel like busy work, especially once you get to the max level campaigns and you're still going around doing sets of 6 quests per area and then moving between them, and you've got 6 chapters plus the optional side chapters. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it has its moments, but I don't think any of them have had as strong of a narrative through line as Warlords of Draenor. And I think the reason why that is the case is because you really get the sense that you are actually invading a new world, and that this is a place where anything can happen, which possibly is just the result of being a massive multiverse timeline, so they feel more at liberty to just kill off characters when they feel that it's appropriate. They killed at the end of Shadow Moon, they killed off the Prophet Velen, and setting aside that they would absolutely never do that in the main timeline, especially for a leveling zone, that is a massive moment. And you get this entire arc, which takes you across the zone, but it takes you across the zone in a way that feels natural, and it actually interests me. Especially with Yrel. I think Yrel was a very well told character in the beginning, at the very least. Kind of hoping for her return at some point in the future, but I was interested when we saved this character at the Dark Portal, and when we were chased by what we thought at the time was the end boss of the expansion out into the various other zones. Like the Horde goes to Frostfire Ridge, and they get their arc with Gunnar, which is also absolutely fantastic. You get an actual full arc for these characters in these zones. It ends with a very dramatic cinematic, and that is what good Warcraft looks like. Talador as well. It has 2 very solid quest lines in it. You start off with the Iron Horde quest line, where you are once again battling one of the end bosses of one of the raids. Not the end boss of the expansion, but Blackhand actually manages to present himself as a real threat to you and to the world. And we lose Murad, and that is real Murad. That is our Murad from our timeline. He dies in a cinematic, in a questing zone, and I think there's something about that modern expansions just absolutely lack in terms of the dramatic quality of their leveling zones. There is a refusal to actually engage with the content that you bought the expansion for. In Warlords of Draenor, this is something that the expansion does very well, at least through the leveling campaign, is it gets you to interact with the warlords. They again, some of them do end up going out like chumps, because as soon as we get to the raids, then everything falls apart. Like, I have no defense for that, but I will defend the fact that the leveling campaign involves you with so many of these hard-hitting stories. And on the other half of Talador, you have the storyline with Gul'dan and his invasion of Auchindoun. Again, another massive character who, in other expansions, we literally did not see until the raid. Like, I think since then, leveling campaigns are generally you run into the important characters during a like really dramatic first 40 minutes to an hour introduction to the expansion. Then you do a bunch of nonsense busy work introductions across all of the zones, and then possibly at the end they do something really. You meet the villain again, and they do something really dramatic, and then you're done. And again, everything in between there is just empty space. Whereas with Warlords, most of the zones, I have no good memories, honestly, of the story in Gorgrond. Spires of Iraq isn't horrible, but I think it's a bit of a letdown compared to the other zones. But Gorgrond, Talador, Frostfire Ridge, and Shadowmoon Valley all have actual impact. They have this constant sense of stakes that keeps you going in the narrative, and I think that's really important. Whereas, I don't know, I mean, as I described, this is literally how the War Within works. You run into Xel'Atath at the very beginning, you have a very well designed and very dramatic opening with the Siege of Dalaran, and then as soon as Dalaran is destroyed, the entire narrative grounds to a halt as you run into the Earthen, and they've got their own shit going on. So you run around with them for a while, and then you randomly stumble into the Arathi, and then you finally go to Azkahet, which actually finally starts to follow up on the initial battle that you had at the beginning of the expansion, but you still aren't actually engaging with that conflict. You're engaging with the revolution against the Queen, which is not nothing, to be sure, but I think it would have been more interesting if we had run into the Queen Ansirek, who at this point was Xel'Atath's loyal servant, or puppet, rather, whatever you want to call it. But there is something. I think there would be a lot more to that if you would actually run into Xel'Atath and run into Ansirek more than once, or twice rather, throughout the entire leveling campaign. I mean, like, the other stories aren't necessarily bad, but there's no through line to it. There's nothing to get me interested. What I joined up in this quest line for was to hunt down Xel'Atath, but you don't get the sense that you are actually hunting Xel'Atath. You just get the sense that you're filling the time so that you can get to max level, so then you can actually do the cool shit in the raids. And once you see it, this just ends up being everywhere, and I think it's a symptom because as much as Legion is overall a pretty good expansion, Legion also suffers from this. As I mentioned, you do not engage with Gul'dan until I think you meet him in the raid. I don't think you would if you're a demon hunter, you see him in the Vault of the Wardens. And then you don't fight him, he just escapes, and then you don't see him again until the end of the Suramar questline in the raid. I don't even think you see him in the questline at all. And Suramar is a well-told zone, to be sure, but there's this sense that you're just doing a lot of busy work in between the actual real arcs of the expansion, especially those zones. So you run into this problem where you can't actually tell a storyline regarding any characters that require development, because you would not know what order people would do the zones in. They tried to fix this in Shadowlands by requiring you to go through a linear campaign to begin with, but honestly, it is still just missing the sauce to this day, and I'm hoping that that's something that resolves itself. But as it stands, there's this fundamental missing part that somehow just clicked perfectly into place for Mists of Pandaria and for Warlords of Draenor, oddly enough. And honestly, for that reason, I think I would be so incredibly down for a reimagining of Warlords of Draenor if they had actually stuck with the initial premise of that expansion, of spending the expansion actually warring against the Iron Horde rather than... okay, so this is a side tangent, but I read somewhere that they rewrote the entire expansion months before release because they got cold feet about making an entire expansion about fighting orcs. And I mean, there is something to that potentially, but really they just completely sabotaged themselves with the amount of content that they needed to cut after that. Like, there was clearly meant to be some sort of a patch in between launch and Hellfire Citadel. The characters, as I mentioned, the previous strong point of the expansion just completely jump from where they left off in the leveling campaign to where they end up in the final cinematic of the Warlords of Draenor. So there's a clear I don't know entirely what happened. I don't know what that was supposed to be. Maybe it would have been absolutely awful if it had come out the way that it was, but as is, there is clearly a missing piece to that expansion, and I would very much like to know what that missing piece would have been. So if they're going to do a Classic Plus with that, if they're going to add back in all the cut content for a Classic release, I would be very interested to see what that has. Okay. Hot take number 3. Blizzard doesn't understand the Horde and the Alliance. So I briefly brought this up a bit earlier. But what it comes down to is I feel that Blizzard lost the ability to understand what was wrong with the Alliance, what the problems were with potentially good intentions, and what the problems were with the self-righteousness of the Alliance. And they lost the ability to understand why people liked the Horde. And this becomes very apparent when you get to Battle for Azeroth, everyone's favorite lore expansion, of course. Actually, no, that's not true. I think that title clearly goes to Shadowlands now. But Battle for Azeroth. So when I think we were all very hyped when we saw the Undercity battle cinematic, because I think this was the first time in World of Warcraft, certainly, that I thought we were going to see a bit of a darker side to the Alliance. We see that very clearly in Warcraft 3. In Warcraft 3, Kael'thas very clearly encounters this dark side. While the Alliance definitely has a real sense of righteousness to them, especially in the original 2 games, a sense of cultural self-righteousness is not always the best environment to create good leaders who are willing to incorporate the views and thoughts of people who are not what they would consider the actual Alliance. And so you get a character like Garithos, who is actively prejudicial against the elves. I don't think he even fights with dwarves until when you're playing as him, have to rescue a group of vagabond dwarves, or derelict dwarves rather. But my point is that there is a real underbelly to the society of the Alliance. And on the other hand, the Horde, though it does definitely have a dark past, something that is fully willing to come to the surface if asked for. If you take a look at Garrosh, I think there is also a sense of found family that is really important to the identity of the Horde, and I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people absolutely love the Horde. Like, going back to Warcraft 3, the thing that the Horde was always doing was incorporating more people into the Horde as they're going. From the beginning, it starts with just the orcs, and then afterwards, I believe this was added with the Frozen Throne, but when Thrall is shipwrecked in the Maelstrom, they encounter the trolls and Sen'jin, and they immediately band together, defeat the Alliance, and go to continue on towards Kalimdor together. And then again, when they arrive in Kalimdor, they immediately bond with the local Tauren, and they become and these 3 just become this massive triumvirate of Horde faction leaders, which proceeded to do literally nothing in World of Warcraft. And this is, in the game itself, placed into stark contrast with the more exclusionary version of the Horde that is represented by Grom. Though Grom initially fights with the sort of mixed factions that we had previously expected, the moment he drinks the demon blood, all of his non-orc units are replaced with orc variants of those races and classes. So the witch doctor is replaced with an orc warlock, and the troll spear thrower, that's not what they're called, headhunter. The headhunters are replaced with a ranged orc unit. It is a very clear through line that the enemy of the Horde is homogenization, is the enemy of the Horde is stagnation. And they carry this lesson forward into the other campaigns. Even at the end of this campaign, they incorporate the Alliance into their forces when they need to confront Grom. And if we're going to break out the video game storytelling terms, in the Ludo narrative, you have a mixed faction of orcs, trolls, tauren, humans, dwarves, and gnomes, going up against a single race faction of orcs with a few demon bosses added in for flavor, and the winner is our multicultural horde and alliance. And there is and this is such a strong through line that honestly you don't even need to really question why the undead joined the horde, though that is also not particularly well explained in the lore. It's something that I buy a lot more easily than the Night Elves joining the Alliance, because again, the horde has its entire Thrall's horde, at least, its entire history, its entire arc has been learning to incorporate the strengths of people who have been oppressed and who have been otherwise completely rejected by their surrounding society. So when Garrosh resurfaces, I think there is a fair shadow of the Horde's past that can still remain within Thrall's horde. Thrall was not able to single-handedly change every single person, but they did continue to do their best. But what I think is unforgivable is how, when we get to Battle for Azeroth, this still doesn't break down. I think that this should have been the Alliance's turn to show its dark side, its pride, its self-righteousness. But the problem is that at the head of the Alliance, you have Anduin, who is, as far as Blizzard is concerned, completely beyond reproach in terms of the narrative and in terms of his choices. And the way that they've written him, certainly, but but every single character ends up airbrushed in order to support this. Jaina, in particular, while she had previously, for the past several expansions, for rather understandable reasons, had been on her war crimes grind set, as soon as we enter Battle for Azeroth, she is suddenly very reasonable about her, war crimes arc. She gets to Kul Tiras, and she clearly feels very guilty about betraying her father. And the expansion ends with her joining up into a large interfaction coalition to put down the real big bad. I still cannot believe how badly they massacred my girl. But again, my point is that the moment that the Alliance has a moment that they would realistically be the bad guys, we have to bend over backwards in order to make this the Horde's fault. So if I was to rewrite Battle for Azeroth, and let me know, maybe I will. I've drawn out plans at various points, but never really gotten down and dirty with it. If I was to rewrite Battle for Azeroth, the biggest change is that I would immediately just remove the burning of Teldrassil as a plot point completely. Maybe we can have a Kalimdor-based battle later that ends up fighting into Darkshore, but I think there is fully enough in-story justification for the Alliance to invade Lordaeron at the beginning of Battle for Azeroth without any provocation for a lot of different reasons, but all of those reasons have been airbrushed over, were just airbrushed over by the time that we got to that point in the story. The burning of Teldrassil was a singular moment that just completely ceded the moral high ground permanently to the Alliance. The Horde is, at that point, just turned itself into an entirely irredeemable, just facsimile of itself. And they go on to justify this very badly. We all know how that turned out. But I think my underlying point is that there were clear identities for both of the factions, and those have slowly slipped away over the years. particularly for the Alliance. And though the Horde is more egregious, I feel that the Alliance, it just exists as this completely airbrushed version of what it originally was. The flaws have all been hidden away or attributed to the corrupting influence of Onyxia. Happens. But at every single moment, we have failed to take the original thematic identity of these characters into consideration when they were going forward with the story. And of course, this has ended with what modern lore looks like in terms of the faction war. In the actual game, factions don't matter, which I don't think is necessarily a problem. Like, I think it's fine that you can run raids and rated PvP content interfactionally. I think that just gives people a lot more options in what races and classes and they're able to play, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But what I do have a problem with is the way that, at least over the past couple of expansions, since Battle for Azeroth, there has been no real push for faction disparate content. So, Battle for Azeroth was the example of this, as both factions had entirely separate war campaigns, and they literally went to different continents. But before that, even in zones that were shared by both the factions, like from BC, you enter Hellfire Citadel, or Hellfire Peninsula rather, and the Horde goes to Thrallmar, the Alliance goes to I can't remember. It was Stromgar? No, that's wrong. No, it was not another. I don't know. I'll look it up later. But the Alliance has their own fortress, and they do a lot of the same quests at various points, but they have their own faction hubs. They have their own characters to interact with. And I think that there's a real loss there in the fact that we haven't gotten that at all for Shadowlands or The War Within. I think that's one of the... or Dragonflight either, rather. Shadowlands in particular felt very un-Warcrafty, just, I think, as a result of that. I mean, it makes sense from a storytelling perspective. I mean, we're just interlopers in the realms of death, so why would we have established faction hubs? But again, as I said, there's a lost sense of dimensionality there. And when we get to Dragonflight, I think this same thing is true. And there were a lot of points where you could have split up the factions and given them separate hubs, separate quests, separate times to interact with the characters. But nowadays, everyone does the exact same content. There are no real differences between the stories that each of the factions engage with. And while I think that has ended up making some sense, I hope that that's something that we can get a return of, because while there is an oddity to the idea that these factions keep needing to join together out of a common need, either against the Lich King, against Deathwing, against Garrosh at the end of Mists of Pandaria, against Yogg-Saron, Cthulhu, all these things. I think that there's something interesting in the way that these factions still might not get along, and not just because of random singular actors, as we might have seen in the latest War Within iteration of the Arathi Highlands. Again, this is what is that? The fourth version of that zone, counting the original in Classic, the revamped zone that they released for Cataclysm, the BFA version, and now the new version, where in both the audiobook and the quest line we end up interacting with this rogue faction who has nothing to do with the actual alliance. We swear they just wanted peace. They're just these people are just singular bad actors. And I think there is some value to these singular bad actors, but bad actors do not a nuanced conflict make. It just makes it seem like these skirmishes are something much smaller than they actually are, as opposed to being at this point, a century's worth of Warcraft lore, all driving all of these different people in different directions for understandable reasons. Everyone should be driven in the same direction for the understandable reasons, but every once in a while there are some characters who just ignore that and just think killing forever for no reason is cool. All right. So after all of that complaining, you might be under the impression that I hate this game, and I don't think I would blame you for thinking that. But what I think really works about the game is something that I think is explained by the biggest divide between modern and classic WoW. And that reason, I think, is the way that the focus of the gameplay clearly changed between the two. So, as a bit of backstory on myself, it took me forever to get into any sort of classic. I would dabble with it a little bit, but I never really made it past level 20. More recently, I decided to really give it a real shot, and I did make it to level 20 on both factions. Still going, possibly. I'm really excited for possibly going back to Classic BC. But my point is that I needed to find my own approach to it, because I was trying to approach Classic the way that I approached retail. And the way that you approach retail in a lot of ways is you go through the leveling campaign in order to get to the more interesting things that are at the end of the line. So once you hit max level, that's where the real, quote-unquote, real game begins. That's where you're able to start running dungeons. That's where you're able to start doing raids. And that's where you start being able to actually engage with the max level story content. And that story content, though again flawed as I've pointed out, tends to be more narratively relevant. You tend to interact with more lore relevant characters for the actual expansion that you're playing. But on top of that, you're able to actually feel like you're at the point of the adventure, which is meant to be the challenge. And that is the biggest difference. When you go back to Classic, it is not about reaching max level. It is about the moment-to-moment gameplay in a way that retail is not for the leveling campaign. So the way that I can explain this is that I think the thing that works about it is not the overarching story. I don't think that has ever been the thing that works for it, outside of a few small exceptions. And there are good tidbits of storytelling, but as an overall product, I think the macro story just does not work. What does work, I think, is the narrative that you make for yourself. And I don't just mean that in the RP sense. I mean that in the meta-narrative sense, as in the way that you played the game, the way that you engaged with it, the people that you met playing it, the way that you relied on those people in order to actually get through what you wanted to do, or what you needed to do. So in Classic, that was definitely for the leveling experience by itself. You were just required to interact with other players, both just because if you go anywhere, you're probably going to run into other people, because the world is just physically smaller, and having to walk places means you're going to be passing other people, and the way that the world is actually dangerous. So you might actually need 2 or 3 people to take out boss mobs, whereas in retail, out in the open world, you can pretty reliably kill everything solo, no matter what it is. If it's elite, if it's rare, anything, you can pretty reliably kill it by yourself, unless it's a world boss. That falls away as soon as you get into the actual raiding content, and I think that's where the appeal comes from. It's because that's where the social aspect comes in. That's where you start actually making the real memories that make up your perception of this game and its story. Personally, having played through Classic, I cannot tell you a single thing lore-wise, basically, about what I did in the Night Elf starting zone, but what I can tell you is the time that I needed to join up with someone who could only speak French in order to go through these barrow dens right around the western side of the zone, outside of Darnassus. Going down in there, I was a priest, and I was not very proficient in the game at that point, and there were other people who were also not that great at the game, and so being terrible at the game together gave me this very specific memory that I will carry with me a lot longer than anything that might have come out of the quest text, or that I might have heard a mob say at some point in a raid or something. So yes, unfortunately, we do have to arrive at that classic cliche: the real Warcraft is the friends that we made along the way. And that has always been the thing that draws people in, and the thing that keeps it going. I think there is room for the story itself to bring people in, but until that day, well, I guess like battered wives, we will keep coming back for the friends we made along the way. Alright. So those are the hot takes that I have for the moment. In conclusion, Blizzard, please, playable Naga with Midnight, ideally, possibly at any point, please. This is my one wish for the game. Please send help. Please send help from my crippling addiction. Alright, this has been, I don't know, I guess this is what a podcast format is like. It's a VelaCast. That's what we'll call it. It's a VelaCast. That's what we're doing. Alright, if you've watched this far, thank you so much for listening to me ramble for, oh gosh, a full hour. There are hopefully more videos upcoming. I've had, like I said, I've had one in the works for a while now, and I've got a lot of creative projects. I've got some editing projects. Overall, I just really want to interact with more people through all manners of storytelling, through video games, through literature, through movies. That's my domain. mainly movies. I am planning on releasing a couple of short films upcoming. I've also got those in the works. I've got a lot of things going on. But until next time, this has been That Bella Vella Productions. All right. See ya.